Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you. Please take your seats and return your tray tables to the upright position because the session is about to start. It's a real pleasure to see you all today. We have a packed speaker line here to the extent I'm going to be standing up for the whole session. So if ever you wanted a good definition of what free consultancy looks like, here it is this morning. And you're sure to get it. We're looking at forecasting the evolution of the supply chain. I don't think the title of the session here needs any further introduction. And I'm delighted with the speakers that we've got today. A couple of the rules that go with the sessions that I moderate here at TOC. One, you can't go to coffee until we've had 3 decent questions. And secondly, if the speakers go over on time, we'll charge them demurrage, and that pays for the martinis this evening. Okay. So without further ado, I mean, no session on this sort of subject would be complete without Professor Hercules Haralabides. We're delighted that you're here to kick us off and set things for us strategically.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for coming here to listen to us this morning. I thank also Informa and the organizers for the kind invitation in Rotterdam, I should say my home city. Our moderator, Steve, said that I should not overrun my 10 minutes, otherwise I will have to give him my hat, which I have it here. So in case he has any ideas about it. And what I will try to discuss with you in these 10 minutes is the things that we have done, and we means my organization and the universities I work with both in Europe and in Asia, in terms of the hot issues and challenges we are facing these days in the broader area of maritime transport, ports and logistics. And of course, this is, as we will see, quite a few things that we have done, things that we consider important. Others may think differently about where priorities should be ascribed to, but this is research that is commercial, industrial research that has been commissioned. It is things that we have done which have been peer-reviewed extensively, so one can give credit to those things, and they are not things that, we do and circulate over the internet. So without wasting more time, let me please see the first slide of the, or can I do it from here probably? Yes.
The green is forward.
That's it?
That's
Yeah,
forward.
yes.
And that's backward. And this is a PowerPoint.
Okay. Does it? Yes, I try, but
It's not working?
not working.
Like point there.
Point it there. There, there. The screen. Oh, it is. Okay. Because I don't see it on the screen, you see. Okay. So let's go back. Huh? Sometimes technology is more than a challenge. Can you try to see if it works?
It's not up.
It's not there.
You can see the screen right there.
I can see the screen there, yes. But there's nothing on the screen now. Okay, until we fix it, is night okay? Forward, okay. Good. Right, now we are okay. So I will start with the first slide, and the first slide I put it there because I would like to put into perspective what we call maritime logistics. And maritime logistics, now it is a term very widely known and used all over the world, but that was a term that I introduced in 2003, 20 years ago, in the journal that I published, which is called also Maritime Economics and Logistics, MEL, and it was an effort to look in an optimized way our overall supply chain from door to door, because that was the time when carriers, they had started thinking that we cannot make a lot of money only from shipping, but we will have to look at differentiated solutions, door-to-door transportation, and we have to do it in an integrated way where we all take an interest in ports, in terminals, in shipping, in distribution, in land transportation. And in this sense, we have done two things. The first two are a little book of something like 100 pages about shipping and ports, quite extensively read, I should say. It had, over the last 4 or 5 years, 50,000 downloads or so. So with all due modesty, I could say that in this little book one can find everything one would like to know about shipping and ports at the board level. Maybe not at the classroom level, but at the board level, because we have done this type of consultancy for all major organizations. And the third item, which concludes this concept of integrated maritime logistics, is things that we have done for the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative for 10 years, since the concept was introduced by President Xi in 2013, and we have looked what could be an ideal optimized way that would facilitate trade not only of China but also of other countries. So we have looked at China, we have looked at Europe, we have looked at West Africa, we have looked at East Africa, and we always look from the optimization point of view. In other words, when people were running every day to Beijing port, European ports, asking for money, and then they were living with a smile and without the money, the idea that we explored, assisted by the Chinese government, was what are ports that could team up in pairs that would make meaningful transportation, cost-efficient transportation. We did the same for West Africa, we did the same for East Africa. And in a way you have to do this because everybody wants money to develop and become what they want to become, but money is not inexhaustible and money is limited, particularly when you go to international donors and ask for it. They would like to understand what is the wider ecosystem of ports and what would make sense to finance or not to finance. We move then to the work that we have done in the area of ports. And in the area of ports, one of the major issues that we have looked is the concept of infrastructure. Why, in the first 3 or 4 works that we have done, actually all this that I'm talking about today is written down, so I will make it available to the organizers. If you want to have it, then you're more than welcome to have it. And the idea of infrastructure becoming gain of interest is that a new concept of port development now is being, let's say, championed by China, and not alone, because we did it also in Europe. An integrated way of thinking about ports and about developing our ports. For 4 years, I was running a small port in the south of Europe, which was a tremendous challenge, and it was fun. And during this period, the Italian government thought that we have too many ports. At that time, we had 24 port authorities. This doesn't make much sense. The Italian government said we have to consolidate and we have to talk more to each other because we don't like the fact that the carrier is coming and is playing one port against the other, whereas we spend public money to develop our ports. And probably then we do not succeed. We have a port which is a ghost because the carrier has a footloose container and it can go and do business with my competitor. So instead of 24, the country ended up with 15 port authorities of regional cooperation, which is a much smarter idea. Years ago, when I was in my first steps in this area, I always thought that competition is important. And a port can do well only if it is in a position to compete. My ideas have changed a lot, and they have gone into the area that we should not compete on infrastructure. We should not duplicate infrastructure. We should not spend public money on infrastructure in order to attract business from our neighbor and our or competitor, if you like, particularly in the European Union, where Brussels will have to check and control and approve all our fiscal budgets, but also in other areas around the world. We should develop infrastructure in a more coordinated way on a regional basis, and once we do this, then we invite and we have the private sector to come and compete by offering them concessions or by offering them operating licenses or anything that we would like to do. We tender our infrastructure to the private sector. Ideally, we tender our infrastructure in a way that promotes competition among them, and not in a way that we try to control a monopolist only. In economics, we have two terms. We have competition for the market, where we give the infrastructure to one whom, of course, we control, or we have competition in the market where we invite everybody who wants to compete and come. You are welcome to come, and then it is your neck on the block. If you know, because the argument often also from Brussels, the European Commission, is that we need to control this because the market is not enough for more than one or two. Anyway, so we have done this, and when you do this, then infrastructure is very important to determine what is the infrastructure, what is your market, what is the origin and destination of your business. So we have done this. We have developed new concepts like the concept of centrality. This is not new, but looking at the problems that we had with COVID-19 and the irregularities, unreliability, and complaints by shippers that we had during those 2 or 3 days, we showed that it's not enough to be well connected. But together with being well connected, you need also to be located properly. Because quite often, they were the well-connected during the COVID years, the well-connected ports that had suffered more than others. We looked into this. We looked into, yes, because let me see if I, yes. Number five was already spoke about it. We looked at which would be the Chinese port that we would like to have participating in the eastern end of the Belt and Road Initiative, and then with whom they could couple and team up in Europe. We did this. Then in shipping, and I want this to be there on this one. In shipping, we looked into alliances, and the formation and dissolution of alliances. We did quite a few on this. For instance, what were the reasons and the motivation behind the divorce among MSC and Maersk? What happened there? Took everybody by surprise, actually. So how shipping alliances are created, how they team up, how they work, and how they break down. We look into this. We looked into inliner shipping. What is the market? If I look at the expectations of carriers, can I say something about the structure of the market they operate? And we saw, for instance, and we proved that in the Atlantic, things were much more concentrated and competition more limited than the situation in the Pacific. We looked into cruise shipping and how cruise companies can enter into emerging markets, which is not something always very easy. We looked into, of course, a very important and difficult subject on emissions trading system, because as you know, the European Union and China, they have decided to include shipping into their ETS system, into the ETS market or finance market, which is becoming a market even bigger than that of oil. So how can we integrate the shipping sector into ETS, and how can the carrier make use and make money from such a development, trading emissions? So we did these things, and I'll try to be very, try to wrap it up because I don't want to lose my hat. And then in the end, things that we did in the wider area of global transport and distribution, if we call it global maritime logistics, we looked into West Africa and see if we can visualize a system of ports that could facilitate the trade of China and of other countries. We looked into one thing that may be, because the time is running up, one thing that is of interest for this conference and for terminal operators is a new concept that we try to promote, and this is the concept of dual cycling. In other words, when a truck is coming into the terminal to drop a container, probably it will be nice if there is an import container that it could take back to the hinterland, and vice versa. Now, if you want to do something like this, it's an extremely difficult operations research problem to solve. It's not easy at all, because you have to give different types of priorities to the incoming trucks, outgoing trucks, internal trucks, different blocks. That's not easy, and it's not even a challenge easy to coordinate an exporter and an importer. So in a way that when the truck goes to the terminal empty to pick up a container, to find a shipper that has a container to be taken to the port, and vice versa. So that was a major thing. It took us 3 years and many people to work this out. Yes, and I think, yes, and maybe 2 words on number one. Number one, you have realized, of course, that we do quite a lot of things in China, from those things that I have been talking about. So number one, it was something we looked into the Yangtze River, and at the estuary of the river, we all know is the biggest port of the world, which is the port of Shanghai. And the idea was, because the Yangtze River is a huge water infrastructure, including hundreds of ports, the idea we explored is that, can we have direct shipping and the appropriate type of ships for this work, so that we can bypass the port and have exports and imports directly with Korea or with Japan or with other countries in the region directly from the river ports, back and forth, rather than having to use the hub of Shanghai. And to do this, you have to decide locations of dry ports, right? We need dry ports, we need inland terminals to do this. And the question is, where do we place them? What are the ideal ways of locating them? That was also a large project. Okay, as I said, I stop here. Thank you for your attention. The whole thing is written up. If you would like to have it, with great pleasure. I think I have already uploaded somewhere, but Matteo can make it available for you. And again, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the attention. Sorry if I took a little bit more time than you gave me, Steve. Thank you. My hat is there, be careful.
I have the professor's hat under the speaker's podium as a deposit, but it would be a hard man that would keep it from him. Thank you very much for keeping to time. So a great way to kick up and look at some strategic overviews. Really interesting to hear that he's had a change in his thinking, that we shouldn't duplicate, shouldn't be about competition when it comes to infrastructure. It should be about regionality and coordinating things better. And interesting analogy with the restaurant trade from the things he was saying. It's not enough to be well connected, it's about location. And so many times when we're doing consultancy for ports, they want to be a transshipment hub, they want to be a free zone, but they don't take into account their local geography, which is a driver for a lot of those different things. Talking about local geography, our next speaker, Darren Fraser, is a transport economist at HPC in Hamburg. They need no introduction. And he's going to be looking at the SADC countries, the regional trading bloc in Southern Africa, and telling us about why they're important and what the alternatives there for trade. I'm delighted he's here. I'm a very strong Africanist, having run a shipping line in a past life to West Africa, and there's always something interesting going on there. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Darren to come to the speaker's podium, and we'll just check that his presentation is properly linked before we carry on.
Is it? Can I view it? Can't view. Okay. Which, sorry?
Green forward and red back.
Back. Okay. Got the technology sorted. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So the next.
That's not yours, is it?
No, I'm gonna have to follow on the screen. I can't follow on the laptop. Okay. So the next discussion is a little bit of a segue from the more strategic supply chain issues, and maybe a little bit more practical around the vulnerabilities that were experienced in the last 3 years. And what we're looking at is really some solutions in terms of building resilience in the supply chain, and specifically if there could be a relationship between the Southern African Development Community and the European Union. So just in terms of context, the Ukraine war and COVID-19 really demonstrated severe vulnerabilities in the supply chain because of reliance on specific countries for production. VW in Germany experienced shutdowns because of plant shortages from the Ukraine. We couldn't get our iPhones on time because of dependence on China for production. And on a very light note, we couldn't even get some staples. The price of oil, cooking oil, for example, increased quite significantly. So these vulnerabilities have prompted, or firstly costed a severe cost to the European zone. Accenture did a calculation, an estimation of a cost of 920 billion euros in terms of a cumulative loss in the last 3 years to the GDP of the Eurozone from these supply chain interruptions. That followed or prompted Ernst & Young to undertake a study interviewing various major supply chain industries to determine if they were taking any action to avoid or mitigate from future such events. The responses were quite significant. More than half of the respondents said they either have taken steps to build resilient supply chains or they are in the process of doing so. And there were 3 methods that they were following. The first, on a very light note, was strategically situating inventories across different nodes within the supply chain. The second was rerouting products from port to port, leveraging transshipments. And the third and most dramatic is actually redirecting production to different geographical regions. And this is really the context or the basis for this discussion in terms of possibility for mitigation. So the question is, can the SADC region serve as an EU supply chain alternative? And the sole purpose would be to diversify. So not completely redirect, not become the next China, but diversify and build some level of resilience for the EU, mitigating against similar risks and reducing the possibility of incurring such huge costs to the GDP of the EU zone. Diversifying supply chain in SADC could have many significant impacts. On the traffic level, there would be increased traffic from SADC to the EU. That would result in increased port activities and consequently, I think for everybody at this conference, increased port-related opportunities in terms of equipment, construction works, technology required, and so on. So what is SADC? What is the possibility of SADC? What is SADC comprised of? It's a composition of 16 countries located in the southernmost point of Africa. It has 400 million people, which are growing at a rate of around 3% and are comprised of 20% young people between the age of 15 and 25. So it's a young growing population. There are about 15 major ports of varying capacities and with varying commodity focuses in the region. And it's also fairly well connected or reasonably well connected, predominantly by road, but still has about 124,000 kilometers of rail infrastructure in South Africa alone. In terms of the GDP outlook, for the region as a whole, it's quite positive. About 4.3% growth is the outlook up to 2024-25 for the region, but that does vary between countries like Mozambique that are looking at about an 8% growth rate and South Africa at below 2% currently. So with that context in mind, what is the relevance or what is the connection between SADC and Europe? Very far geographically, but actually the EU plays a very important role in trade in the region. The EU is second to China in terms of trade, and this is really cemented by the economic partnership agreement that is formed between certain SADC countries and the European Union. Most of the commodities that are exported from South Africa currently are still very much dominated in the extractive raw material commodities, so such as raw materials, minerals, precious stones, and agri-products. So if SADC is to be considered a diversification alternative for EU, what are the conditions for that? And to understand what that criteria might be, we look at China. And China has had specific criteria that has made it the exporter or exporting giants in the world that it is today. It has government policies and political will that has driven and to support manufacturing and exports. There are special economic zones that have actually focused on specific manufacturing areas with reduced regulatory barriers. There's been huge drives in infrastructure, ports, road, rail, airports, and of course, scale and efficiency in terms of low cost and moving fast to market is unrivaled in China, coupled with the skilled workforce. So can SADC meet these conditions is the question and support EU diversification? Firstly, on the government policy side, Southern Africa's countries are really moving away or tending to move away from becoming extractive. There are policies in place for beneficiation. So moving away from pure raw materials. Botswana is a really good example of that, with the diamonds that are usually cut and polished in London and Antwerp. The Botswanan government actually required that beneficiation take place in Gaborone in Botswana, and that's been one of the drives. There are some preferential tax rates and preferential fiscal incentives. The German government has been the German market has been quite successful in South Africa through South Africa's AIS Automotive Investment Scheme. BMW, VW are based and with manufacturing assembly of vehicles in South Africa, exporting to global markets. That's on the positive, together with some of the trade agreements like the EPA agreement that I mentioned earlier. There are still significant challenges though. Special economic zones, the region does not fare very well in this regard. It's currently, SADC currently only has 10% of the special economic zones on the whole continent. The lead for this in Africa is currently East Africa, with Kenya having at least 66 special economic zones alone. So a bit of work to be done there. With regard to the institutional reforms, these have been slow and unpopular with Labour. South Africa specifically has had a institutional lock-in with the ports being managed by the government, but this is slowly changing, but it's still being seen by some as restrictive in terms of efficiencies and growth. And then finally, from an ease of doing business perspective, as we can see from the graph on the left-hand side, this is extremely varied among the SADC nations. Countries like Mauritius are quite positive, having very good ease of doing business indices, whilst Angola, Madagascar, and others don't fare really well with ease of doing business. Infrastructure, and focusing specifically on port infrastructure in SADC, this is also quite varied. There is just under 9 million TEU capacity of container capacity in the region. This is predominantly held by South Africa with about 5.7 million, and then there's varying smaller and medium-sized terminals, both gateway and intermediate hubs. There is quite a bit of expansion that has taken place. We've just seen the commissioning of Walvis Bay's new container terminal, 750,000 TEUs made available, with only about 24% of that currently being utilized. So leaving significant opportunity for potential tranships and other cargo. Maputo is also seeking to expand their terminal with their 3B expansion, moving up to about 1 million TEUs. On the ownership side, there are quite a few global terminal operators operating in the region. However, and there's also the much anticipated finalization of the concession of Durban Container Terminal, the biggest in the region, as well as the Ngqura Terminal in Port Elizabeth. Looking at efficiencies, so I have two graphs, or two visuals on this graph, and they're both opposite extremes. On the right-hand side is the Container Port Performance Index, so focusing purely on container port performance, which is quite dismal. The larger ports, Cape Town, Durban, Ngqura, and Luanda, are the poorest performing in the region, whilst the smaller ports, Walvis Bay and PE, are marginally more efficient, but still as a whole, port performance in the region is not at the level that it should be, so leaving a lot of opportunity for improvement. On the left-hand side, however, the opposite holds true on a broader logistics efficiency index. South Africa, for example, is on par at 19th with China, signifying that the country has very good track and trace abilities, very good quality of logistics, road networks, and so on. So very opposite view in terms of efficiencies and a lot of improvements required on the port side. So how can SADC serve as a supply chain mitigation for Europe? I don't know. I have your attention now. It's quite mixed. I think, firstly, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, the objective would not be to move or for SADC to become a China. This is a diversification opportunity. So it would be about identifying which commodities required in Europe could potentially either be produced in SADC or be transshipped to build a buffer and reduce risk in the supply chain. The possibility does exist based on the excess capacity, particularly on the transship side in Walvis Bay and to some extent in Gucha. And also long-term manufacturing or moving manufacturing to some of the special economic zones within and utilizing some of the government incentives for production could actually allow for this kind of mitigation. What does it mean for in terms of port opportunities? If this is to be realized, it would definitely increase port traffic, container traffic. It would require larger expansion because as we see in South Africa alone, it's almost at 70% capacity utilization, the container ports already. And there would probably also be increased opportunities for private sector involvement with the transfer of ownership from state-owned, particularly in Durban and Nguga, providing more opportunities and moving away from the constraining public sector procurement practices that currently are inhibiting a lot of technology and a lot of opportunities for expansion in the region. So depending on the solution required, SADC could support supply chain resilience to Europe and building resilience. To end, I just have one or two success stories in terms of maybe the first one being in sort of a relatively unknown country, Lesotho. It's located in the middle of South Africa. It's a mountain kingdom, but actually is very active in supporting the American textile industry. 80% of the garments that are manufactured in Lesotho are actually manufactured for Gap, for Levi's, and shipped via Durban to the United States. It's a very small country, but it's actually been very successful and very competitive in relation to the Asian market. From the automobile perspective, as well as with electrical appliances and electrical components, Lesotho's also set up economic zones and economic manufacturing parks to support Volkswagen, BMW, Nissan, and Toyota. I think South Africa similarly has had quite some successes working with European industries. On the vehicle manufacturing side, VW, Mercedes have set up production plants, leveraging the incentives available by the government and increasing both container components being imported into the country and then fully built units being exported via Durban's Ro-Ro terminal to countries like Australia and Japan. And then finally, Liba, who might be here, where they have a stand. Liba's also been quite successful with the procurement of the cranes in South Africa, have set up a maritime hub in Durban where they provide training and they also provide support for their cranes from the Durban Training Center for the continent of Africa. Thank you very much.
Darren, thank you very much indeed. Great presentation and really interesting to hear your strategic thoughts on the SADC region and their opportunities. And there's certainly a lot going on down there, and that 124,000 kilometres of rail serves right up into places like DR Congo, and the logistics operations from South Africa into the hinterland of Africa are really pretty impressive. And South Africa's been able to to grow and industrialize, one of the problems that Africa faces is that you need more than the 50%, according to an economist, Charlie Robertson, you need more than 50% literacy rate for you to get growth in African countries, and you need more than an 80% literacy rate if you want to industrialize. And South Africa's got a literacy rate of 93%. South Africa's got a literacy rate of 93%, which is one of the reasons why it's got the benefits of growth that it has. For those of you that are interested in the African markets, TOC is running TOC Africa, and it will be in Morocco, September the 20th, 21st, and it promises to be a very exciting event looking at that market, and so do come along. Moving on now to, on questions, please don't let them slip through your brain and out the other side. Do make a note of your questions, and we'll try and deal with them in a structured manner, speaker by speaker, after everybody's finished. But in the meantime, let's move on to Jordi Torrent, who's the head of strategy at the Port of Barcelona and the Secretary General of MedPorts, and he's going to be talking to us about supply chain issues from both perspectives.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Before I start, let me say a couple of things. First, it's weird and not to be on an all-men and male panel, which is not very common lately, fortunately. So my apologies to the moment on the room on my behalf. Second, I'm here wearing two hats. I'm the head of strategy of the port and the general secretary of MedPorts. MedPorts is a port organization of the Mediterranean, a young organization. So I'm wearing two hats. I can take one maybe from you, virtual. So I will be speaking with both hats. As I said, you all probably know the Port of Barcelona. MedPorts is a port organization that gathers the main ports in the region from the four shores of the Mediterranean, north, south, east, west. And third, the title of my presentation obviously is probably too ambitious, too broad. If we had to speak about all this in 10 minutes, I mean, it's impossible, we need days, no? So I would just give some hints on these topics and set the scene maybe open for the Q&A session after the presentations, okay? So I will move ahead. So I will start from a MedPort perspective, a Mediterranean port perspective, both generally and as Port of Barcelona, where we are when we think about the supply chain, some particularities about the Mediterranean, some examples about what is happening in Barcelona on some of these topics and how we are reacting a little bit. Okay, so there's only 4 slides that you're gonna see from me. So this more or less we all know where we are. We are back to low freight rates. When we speak about containers, there's always a but in all of these topics. So we are in very low freight rates when we speak about containers. But for instance, when we speak about cars, we see how the freight rates for cars, for the transportation of cars, for instance, between Asia and Europe, between Shanghai and Barcelona, for instance, are still higher than they used to be. So that's why, for instance, in different Mediterranean ports, the unloading of cars inside containers has increased a lot in the last 6 months, okay, to avoid the high freight rates that we see for car carriers transporting cars between the two regions. We have an improved reliability, obviously, as you all know. Basically, terminal operators, you know it better than us, but still far from what we had before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, at least in Barcelona, we had normally a reliability around 90% of the port calls, of the expected time of arrival on a day. We went down in all major ports in the region to 30, 20%, even in some periods of 2021, beginning 2022. And now the reliability is improving a lot, and now we are a little bit beyond 50%. No? So the vessels, and I'm speaking here about containers only, the vessels call on the day, on the expected time of arrival on the day, on more than 50% of the cases, much better than last year, but still far from what we had before the pandemic. Obviously, as you probably have listened, and you know very well, during these days, we see a lot of vertical and horizontal integration when we speak about shipping lines. the country where I come from, Spain, I think is one of the places in Europe, I would say, and I don't know all the experience here, but where this is happening very fast, probably faster than in other countries. We see shipping lines. We have seen shipping lines in the last 12 months, but obviously running terminal container terminals, but buying rail operators, managing inland terminals, buying equipment, constructing rail equipment, so that in Spain, for instance, shipping lines can offer a door-to-door solution to their customers from an inland location inside China to an inland location inside Spain. And this is happening very fast, okay? And it's happening also in other countries, but I would say that Spain is a good example where this is happening faster and more profoundly, I would say. We see, as you all know, a huge order book in the shipyards in Korea, in China, of all the shipping lines that they are beginning to receive the vessels now. MSC is leading the way, but also other shipping lines are doing the same. In Europe, very important, we see how this legislative package of Fit for 55 is being approved, one measure after the other. ETS, alternative fuel infrastructure regulation, EU fuel maritime, and this is going to have a strong impact in our ports. Positive impact, no, because this is helping in speeding up the energy transition in our sector, but it also has some challenges or threats, because this legislation is going to be applied in European ports, but not in ports that are not a part of Europe, in the north of Africa, in the UK, and there's some concerns that there could be some carbon leakage, traffic diversion to ports where all this is not applied. You know that from next year, vessels will have to pay for the emissions they do when they call in European ports from next year, and in 3 years' time they will have to not pay. I don't know the exact word how you say it, but for 100% of the emissions, and this will not happen in other ports that are not part of the European Union. So there's some risk here of carbon leakage and traffic diversion, for instance, with transshipment. Okay, and also with other traffics. Disruptions, we see how everything has gone relatively quite back to normal, but any disruption can happen at any moment. I saw the day before yesterday a huge sandstorm in the Suez Canal. Nothing happened, but we all remember what happened in March 2020. And the day before yesterday, the images of the sandstorm in the Suez Canal, I think it was the day before yesterday, were amazing. Okay, fortunately nothing happened. We see AI not penetrating in all of our sector, in all of our activities. And then we see, and this is going to be the third slide of what I'm going to present, we see this trend. Is it a trend? Is it a myth? Is it a reality? How long is it going to take? Of this decoupling somehow between Western economies and Asian economies, basically led by China. Is this really something anecdotic? Is it something that is going to go deeper? Let's see. I will show you a few figures just to set up the scene for discussion. Okay. So in our region, in the Mediterranean, okay, we are a little bit far here from the Mediterranean. What are we seeing? We are seeing very similar things, obviously, and I'm not going to mention them here, but a couple of things that maybe are quite specific about our region. One, an increase in transshipment capacity. We see that in the north of Africa, particularly in places like Morocco, the increasing capacity in terminals is growing, but also in other countries, in Spain, in Italy, and in other countries as well, in Egypt. But Morocco is a particularly interesting case. Tangier already is the biggest port in the Mediterranean in container traffic, not only transshipment, import-export a lot. So this one particular turn of our region. We see also that intra-regional trade for containers, for trucks, for cars is growing a lot. And I think there's two trade relations that are worth mentioning. One is Morocco, north of the Mediterranean. We see how traffic across the Gibraltar Strait, the shipping lines connecting Tangier, Barcelona, other ports in Morocco with France, with Italy, this traffic is growing a lot. Through the Gibraltar Strait, there is every year more than 500,000 trucks that cross the strait in order to go deeper into Europe. Some projections say this will double in a few years, okay? And we see how this is growing a lot. So this one trade relation that is growing a lot. We see also the traffic between Turkey and different countries in the region growing a lot as well. For instance, the shipping relation between different ports in Turkey and the North Adriatic, Koper, Trieste, Rijeka, is growing a lot. So inter-regional trade is growing since before the pandemic, but I would say more intensively now, and this has something to do also with all the decoupling, nearshoring that is happening in the industry in several sectors. Okay, we see, for instance, how Turkey is becoming, and Morocco, for instance, and I'm forgetting other countries, but just to mention those two, is becoming big industrial powers for home appliances, for cars, for textiles, and all this is pushing the trade and shipping relations between the four shores of the Mediterranean. Also in our region, and this more on the north of the Mediterranean than in the south, but in the south also in some places as well, energy transition is speeding up. Before the pandemic, when we spoke about OPS imports, for instance, this was something, this is in California, in Scandinavia, no? And we were all far from having OPS available for cruise ships, for container ships, for ferries. And now all the projects in order to deploy OPS in ports are speeding up a lot. In our case, in Barcelona, we'll have next year already one of our container terminals with OPS available for container ships. At the end of the year, we are going to have it for ferries, and similar projects are having in other ports in the region, in Valencia, Marseille, and in other ports. So OPS will be deployed in all major, I believe OPS will be deployed in all major European and Mediterranean ports in 2, 3, 4 years' time. And if we think about the Fit for 55 package of legislation that is being approved, that sets up 2030 as the limit for vessels, almost all vessels, to connect to the electricity, the ATS that they will have to pay, etc., I think that we'll see major container vessels, ferries, cruise ships connected to the electricity in ports very fast. And then we have the issue of bunkering of alternative fuels, which there's some places that are working a lot in order to have production plants, be able to bunker green methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, etc. So this is going faster than expected, obviously in Europe, but also in the Mediterranean. And finally, I'm on the issue of this decoupling, between the Western economies, Asian economies, China. Is this a myth? Is it a reality? I don't know. I see, as I have said from the previous slide, we see certainly a trend of some intra-regionalization of traffic, things that were produced in the Far East that are being produced again in Europe or in countries around Europe, and I mentioned Turkey and Morocco, for instance. But this is also only a minority, still, and here you see the figures of my port of Barcelona, some figures for containers, the traffic from different countries in 2022 in total, I think, and import and export in the first months of the year. This is not a trend, obviously, because this is only 1 year, but I think it gives us a few hints of where we are heading, and we see. And we were mentioning with one of the panelists here, we see how traffic, for instance, with Vietnam is growing a lot. In comparison, it's growing a lot both in imports and a little bit in export. We see also traffic with India is growing a lot. In comparison with traffic with China, that is slowing a little bit. Obviously, it's still the biggest trade partner when it comes for containers of our port, by far. Okay, but we see traffic from countries like Vietnam, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, Korea is doing very well as well. South Korea, growing a lot. In 2021, there was a report issued, a study issued in the US, very good report that interviewed more than 1,500 businessmen in the US, and they told them, how is all the disruptions affecting you? no? And they were saying, no, we have been very much affected, and a lot of them say we are trying to shift our production sites. It's very difficult, but some were doing, and the first countries that came on the list where they wanted to shift the productions were not the US, were not Europe, were Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. Then came the US, India again, very important, okay? But we see how this, some production sites are moving south in the continent, and also some coming back to the Mediterranean and Europe. But at the same time, and I put here under, and I will leave it here because I might have run already out of time. At the same time, I put here our import and exports of cars in our port in the first, I think this is in the first 4 months of the year. I think, I'm not sure because I didn't put it. But you see how the import of vehicles from China is growing amazingly. Okay, these are basically electric vehicles produced in China from Chinese companies and Western companies, Tesla, for instance. So this is growing a lot. We receive, as you have seen, we are receiving tens of thousands of cars, electric cars being produced in China, for the distribution later in different European countries, in Spain, France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, etc. So at the same time that I explain what is happening for certain traffics with containers, we see how imports of electric vehicles, import of solar panels is also growing a lot, and the main origin is again China, Korea, etc. So I will leave it here in order to not use the time for our next panelist. And just this is because I like the letter D. That's it. It's only because of this. This is a little bit what we as sports should do in general to adapt to this strange world that we are heading in the next years. And I will leave it here. Thank you so much.
Jordi, thank you very much indeed for your presentation and really interesting illustrations how trade is like water and finds the easiest route with the change in freight rates and cars being containerized, and your concerns that with the regulations on fuel efficiency that there'll be leakage of cargo, finding an easier way. Let's move on straight away to the next speaker because time is not our friend today. I'm delighted to introduce to you Bogan Aldowski, who's the Secretary General of the Baltic Ports Organization, and I'm hoping we're going to hear some similar issues from him, and so that we can compare on how regions are differing.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Yes, I'm from the Baltic, and as you can see, we were traveling from southern part of Africa through Mediterranean now to Baltic, to the very north of Europe. Well, just 2 or 3 slides about us. We are the non-profit association in the Baltic, registered in Estonia, but having an office in Gdynia, Poland. And we are about 50 members from all countries apart from Russia. This is our chairman, Kimonaski from Hamina Kotka Ports, Finland, and our mission is to contribute to sustainable development of the maritime and port sectors in the region. And by doing this, we believe we increase competitiveness of the whole region. Well, I was asked to talk about potential role of the Baltic ports in handling the intra-European trade. In fact, it is not only potential role, because we play a role now, and it's a huge role simply to handle the trade between the north and the south. And this is just the example of the RoRo services in the Baltic. So you can see how dense this network is. The main flow, the main trade is between Sweden and Germany, and there are lots of ports, but also shipping lines handling that trade. So in the lower part of the map, then there is also huge trade between Finland and Germany. So along the Baltic, I would say, and then of course between the Poland, Sweden, and Baltic states, and Sweden, and also very heavy traffic between Finland, Helsinki, and Tallinn. Just some of the latest statistics for RoRo. So German ports, Swedish ports, Helsinki, Tallinn, those are the leaders in that part of the business. But when it comes to container services, it's a bit different story, because the containers are being brought by big ships to North Sea ports or Gdańsk or Klaipėda, and then being distributed by feeder services with the loop system. So the feeder are calling many Baltic ports and close the loop, I don't know, in a week time or so. This is the intermodal service in the Baltic region. So you can see also how dense it is in that region, in the Baltic, but also in North Sea. So the major ports are also having quite a dense network of intermodal connections. And of course, this is the recent situation, and this is the recent role of the Baltic ports when serving the intra-European trade. Again, statistics, and there are also quite recent ones. Lots of changes, especially in Russia. Russian ports lost a lot of containers, about 60 or even more percent. And also due to the fact that Gdańsk is a hub port, but used to also serve Russian market, there is a significant drop of containers traffic in the Baltic. Surprisingly, Klaipėda is a rising star in the Baltic. More and more containers, more and more direct calls to Klaipėda. Now changing maybe a bit to this one of the decoupling, or maybe the question if there is a trend to move productions from Asia to Europe. I think this is one of the results of the similar survey that you mentioned before, and so the map shows what are the potential countries to move the production from Asia to. If I'm not mistaken, it was prepared by my colleague, but generally it shows the trends where the new production could be placed. We have looked at the foreign direct investment in the region. We have tried to see if there's any trend, long-term trend in Central Europe and Turkey. Maybe the graph on the left side is not very visible, but at least you can see that the value of this investment is going up quite rapidly in Poland. Then in Turkey it's a bit different story, because they're still having a problem with the economy and high inflation and Erdogan's approach towards inflation, for example. But also I think the third one is Czech Republic, and also Romania and other countries are going up. So in fact the foreign direct investment in the region is growing. What that means? That means that we could expect increase, because usually the direct investment is also connected with the production of goods, and then with the international trade. So what we are expecting in the region, that probably the trade volumes between southern part of Europe, Central Europe, and Turkey, and Nordics plus Finland will increase in the future. This is I think one year, 2021, and the numbers of the projects, foreign direct investment projects in different countries. So it's a number of them, but again Poland is having the highest number. Then I like very much maps. So this maps shows the potential of the cargo flows between Nordics, Baltic, and the southern part of Europe. And then we also drew the corridors. Two of them are part of 10T corridors, the Med corridor and Baltic-Adriatic corridor. And then also on the very east, there is a new project sponsored or promoted by Polish government, Via Carpatia, which goes very closely to Belarusian border and then Ukrainian borders and then down to even to Greece. So when you look at that, you could think whether these corridors, recent corridors, would handle future trade. I'm afraid we not completely. We have to probably change some structure of these corridors in near future if the trade would develop between the north and the east of Europe. And at the end, I'd like to tell you that, of course, we have a terrible event, terrible war, the Russian aggression on Ukraine in just next to our doors. And apart from these terrible events, people are simply dying, and there was so much people emigrating, moving from Ukraine to Poland, for example, just at the beginning of the war. But of course we have to also look at the business, and just in autumn last year we have done some research about the consequences of all this situation. So not only the war but also the sanctions on the Baltic ports, and you are very welcome. If you are interested, we can send it to you, no problem with that. I want to finish with the map, no summary, but just the map. So the map shows that in fact we are now building the trade barrier between the east and the west. And I'm not saying this is good or not or bad. Probably that's the only way now to deal with our neighbor in Russia. But the fact is that, you know, for example, if you look at Poland, Poland was always treated as the crossroad country. So there was a trade between west and east, and from the north and south. Now this direction, west and east, is a weak point of the trade. So everybody is looking now more in the trade between the north and the west. And Ukraine, let's see what would happen with Ukraine once the war is over. I assume Ukraine would become a member of European Union sooner or later. It's a huge country, huge production, a huge consumption. So there will be a lot of new trade with Ukraine. I was just last week driving from Klaipeda down to Poland, and there is a very nice highway, and I saw quite many Ukrainian trucks. So I was a bit surprised, because I thought, well, Ukraine during the war probably is not trading that much, but the number was really surprising. And of course, from Klaipeda they can go via Ro-Ro services to Nordics. So we are going to have a change in that part of Europe because of the war, and because of the Ukraine would probably join European Union sooner or later, and the barrier of the trade between the west and the east. So with this main points, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bogdan, thank you very much for bringing us up to date on your trade patterns, and we're hearing that for different reasons how trade is changing in different regions, and very interesting to see the effect that FDR is having in some countries, and the political issues changing view from a strong east-west trade to more north-south trade. Now, you may have noticed that we're running over time. We're just going to take a breath, before we move to the last two speakers, but I want you to know that we're going to keep going and make the most of the fact that we've got 6 good speakers with us today and give them the time to go through their presentations and give you time for the questions that I know that you're going to have afterwards. So without further ado, let's move on to Peter Sludveg, who's the CEO of Long An International Port, and I'll let him tell you about it, where it is and what's happening.
Okay, thank you, Steve, for the introduction. Very nice to be back in Europe. I've attended a total of 10 TOCs in Asia. This is my first time in Rotterdam. It's good to be here. For your information, I represent I'm also wearing 2 hats. I represent the Dongtam Group and Long An International Port, those 2 logos right there. But not only do I have 2 hats, I also have 2 logos, and I have to thank TOC for giving me the 2 logos for the price of 1. So briefly, just who am I? I started with APM Terminals in 2007. Moved to Copenhagen in 2010, working in global sales. And then in 2012, moved to Busan, South Korea, and opened the semi-automated terminal there for about 10 years, and 11 months ago I became CEO of this particular port. So it's a pleasure to move from a conceptual to an example of an actual terminal and port investment with respect to this session's topic. LAIP, which is Long An International Port, is the latest exciting port development, and in my opinion, in the hottest province of Long An in southern Vietnam to invest in. You probably did not know before. Other than my colleagues, I don't think anybody has heard of Long An province before. Very good, 1 or 2. Well, you should, and I'll tell you why. Many of you that are aware of southern Vietnam are probably wondering why it makes sense to add another 1 million TEUs of container capacity, especially in my location. But I will explain that next and try to give you some insights as to why we have this confidence to invest so much in container capacity, but also port and wider logistics in Long An province. Yes, we are all experiencing growth decline and continued inflation, including in Vietnam. However, Vietnam, as you can see, remains somehow well above water with, especially compared to its peers of developing companies, or sorry, not companies, developing economies. Inflation in Vietnam is at 5%. It's lower than the world's average of 7%, and it completely bucks the trend of global inflation, developing economies bearing the brunt of it at 8.6%. Sorry. Vietnam's GDP growth also declining, but anyway you look at it, 5.8% is extremely healthy by any standards. Other sources also show this positive outlook. The Asian Development Bank, for example, puts Vietnam's growth this year at 6.5% and next year at a similar number, 6.8%. And in fact, in 2023, Vietnam first quarter, we already posted a 3.3% growth in GDP. Well, of course, there are reasons why Vietnam's numbers are impressive, and I think will continue to impress, and that's because of strong long-term fundamentals, such as a young population, so the average age is only 32.5 years old, which means a readily available workforce, inexpensive labor force as well, and a growing labor force. And also a growing middle class. In fact, the middle class is projected to grow to 36 million people in Vietnam by 2030. And we all know that a growing middle class is a major engine of growth and GDP growth in an economy. So these ongoing long-term trends and fundamentals are, of course, recognized by many companies, including port operators and carriers investing in Vietnam. So to give you some recent examples of investments, APMT is partnering with HHIC to make a deep water terminal in Hai Phong, in the north of Vietnam. In the center, Adani has recently committed to invest $10 billion in Vietnam, starting with the deep water port in Da Nang in the middle. And in the south, I'm sure we've all heard of MSC's $6 billion plan to build a mega transshipment hub, which Ho Chi Minh City government is actively considering. So this interest is supported by continued growth of foreign companies and manufacturers, especially in Vietnam, as shown by these recent examples. Apple is moving more and more and expanding its production in Vietnam, as well as many other global brands establishing themselves and growing in the country as well. Now, this of course highlights another long-term, in my view, long-term growth fundamental for Vietnam, which is caused by geopolitical shifts. So many global manufacturers, as you may know, are adopting a China plus one strategy. So that sees Vietnam as one of the top, if not the top alternative in the region to invest in instead of China, because of young workforce, labor force, not expensive, stable economic and political situation, etc. And moreover, which is also a consideration, Vietnam shares a border with China, so that means very easy access to China's infrastructure as well. Of course, it's not all good news, with Vietnam continuing to present some fundamental challenges to further development in ports and logistics in particular. Right? So at a national level, there is really almost zero state budget, historically and currently, to invest in ports. Unfortunately, this has resulted in an oversupply, an overcapacity of much smaller ports, which leads to more competition, which leads to lower rates, which of course leads to a less than profitable investment, or a less profitable investment. So Vietnam continues to suffer from, especially in the south, bad roads, almost no rail connections at all, just a small one in the north, and a lack of highways, especially between cities and ports. And where there is infrastructure investment by the government, infrastructure improvement can be slow and not always on schedule. Another difficult characteristic that makes investing and looking to the long term quite a challenge is it's really difficult to get quality data regarding the markets and infrastructure and development plans, especially future focused. And of course, this is key to any investment decision, especially the size that is necessary in Vietnam. Specifically, all these challenges are manifesting themselves in the south, where Long An International Port is. Here you can see the map of the Ho Chi Minh area. So on the left side top, you can see that all the feeder domestic and barge terminals are concentrated around very built-up urban area. And you can see on the right of Ho Chi Minh City area, you can see the concentration of deep water ports also very much in a congested urban built-up area. The red crane down there is the location of Long An International Port, which is exactly on the border of Ho Chi Minh City province and Long An province, which brings many benefits, which I'll explain. So LAIP and also our shareholder, the Dong Tam Group, we are solving the industry's challenges and Vietnam's challenges by adopting a dual strategy. And this is the title of my presentation, namely the strategy of taking advantage of those long-term fundamentals and growth fundamentals and fueling them at the same time. So from the group point of view, it's not just the port, which I'm CEO of, which is number one there in the red circle, but it is the group's intention to develop the economy of the entire area, not just by providing port logistics, also providing a logistics center, an industrial park, and an urban area, for a total of about 2,000 hectares of development plans by the group, not just the port. The group has confidence. Of course, they have the funds to do this, but not only the funds, but the confidence to do this, primarily because of the phenomenal strategic advantages, competitive advantages that the location in Long An presents. So Long An province, now that you all know this, is a very, very good performing province, and it's the next option to investing because Ho Chi Minh City is slightly more expensive, it's more congested, and Long An has more space and is much cheaper as well. Evidenced by the 8.4% growth in 2022 and first quarter of 3.8, both well above the national average. And this is being recognized. Coca-Cola just started building the largest factory in Vietnam in Long An province. For cargo owners and shipping lines specifically, which is important for the port, of course, there are some very clear competitive advantages to a port and a logistics hub being located in Long An. You can see that ship in the middle right there, that's the location of the port. This means that because of that location, it's a shorter travel distance from all of those 12 provinces to the south in the orange to Ho Chi Minh and to international connections than to any other port or any logistics hub. We have low handling rates as well in Long An province, and this is because the government sets floor and ceiling rates, and Long An province are amongst the lowest. And a really big one is for cargo owners and containers especially, is that there is no infrastructure surcharge. So what this means in Ho Chi Minh, for every TEU there is a $10 infrastructure surcharge by the government. In Long An, just below, it doesn't exist. So that's an immediate benefit for cargo owners, an incentive to come to Long An instead. So these advantages, they're not new, they're already being taken advantage of, as evidenced by Long An province's many industrial zones. So you can see in the area that we are closest to, that we have the competitive advantage, we can offer a competitive advantage for, there are a total of 102 industrial zones. And Long An province up there on the top, you can see has the most at 22, and it's going to expand to 37 in the future. Also, some national infrastructure projects will soon benefit Long An province. Proportionally, the ring road, that big green one there, is proportionally is going to benefit Long An province more, with 71 kilometers of that road in the province when it is completed by 2028. Also, additional infrastructure projects have been announced, such as the Greater Ring Road project, including those 2 other circles, and other projects encouraged by Vietnam's grand 2030-2050 infrastructure plan. So that's more on a macro, more on a micro level from the port-specific perspective. It is also Long An International Port's strategy to fuel and take advantage of the long-term growth fundamentals at the same time. So in doing so, we're fueling it by providing multi-purpose end-to-end logistics, one-stop shop solutions, freight forwarding, customs, warehousing, etc. And we have started with 3 bulk and general berths, 10 warehouses, barge and truck services, the whole gamut. And in fact, next week on June 24th, we are going to launch officially 1 million TEUs of container handling services as well. This is a picture of the port taken about 2 weeks ago. So you can see that we have 7 berths there, of which the ones on the bottom end are container, 2 container. We bought equipment from Mitsui in Japan, so you can see 6 STS cranes there, the biggest in the channel. You can see 18 RTGs. We have 900 reefer plugs to start with. And more importantly, this picture really just illustrates the massive amount of space that we have to play with, which means we can be quite flexible, and also because we have one shareholder, we can be quite flexible to expand along with the needs of customers, the market, industry, etc. So we're quite excited about that. Altogether, the investment in this port, just the port, is about $500 million US. So essentially, the purpose of Dongtang Group, and therefore also the port's dual strategy, is really to generate a self-fulfilling ecosystem, with one element fueling the other element and vice versa. And it gives me the confidence from the port perspective is that because we have all of this development, I can very quickly reach the critical mass that is necessary for shipping lines, domestic barges, and even international shipping lines up to 7,000 TEU to come to our terminal and start calling there. So, in conclusion, now you all know where Long An province is, and that it has an incredible amount of potential in southern Vietnam. So we're definitely a port and a province to watch in the future. So stay tuned, please. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for educating us. It sounds like a hugely exciting project, and I'm sure there'll be some questions from the audience. So, last but not least, and I think we should thank Rob Harrison for his patience today. I'm going to hand over to him. He's VP and Logistics Europe for DP World, and we look forward to your perspective.
Which one do I use?
Forward, back.
Backwards. All right, brilliant. I also just thank you for your patience. I know it's probably been a bit of a stretch, but yeah, okay. Appreciate it anyway. So the idea today is for me to give you a chat about the logistics integration race. I think this is probably one of those topics out there that is on everybody's minds, and just sort of some of the logic as to why this is going to happen. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to predict the outcome, but definitely give you some of the basis and the logic for actually why it does make sense. I think as indicated, my name is Rob Harrison, Vice President for Logistics and Freight in Europe for DP World. I'm a South African. I have an Irish passport. I live in Belgium. I work in Rotterdam and am responsible for 12 sites plus across Europe. So a little bit about DP World. I think this is where we're heading. So we are not just a ports and terminals business. We are much more than that. And I think this is part of our ambition, is that we actually want to extend beyond just being a ports and terminals business. And the logic is quite sound. We believe that the market and the customers are asking for a more integrated solution. Somebody that can actually have more of an influence over the end-to-end flows of their particular cargo. So this is the footprint that you see today. It is global. We may not be the biggest in the world in terms of terminal operators and locations, but we do actually have the biggest footprint, most number of locations around the globe. And I think that that puts us in a very good position to actually execute this strategy as we go forward. So maybe just a little talk of where we will take you today. So we'll look at the current global trade landscape very briefly. I know you've heard from some esteemed colleagues here from South Africa, from the Baltics, down in the Mediterranean, and then also across in Asia. So just a little bit of our view, or my view, on where this is traveling. And then a little bit about redundancy and resilience. And I think those are really, really key elements that are going to drive the change, the next change in our industry. And what that transformation, and what will that bring about in terms of transformation in the value chain. And then really just a little bit about the actual logistics integration race and how it's going to play out. So really a little bit more about this idea about global trade. Yes, there are a lot of disruptions. It's really good to see that all the colleagues on the panel here are all bullish and optimistic about supply chain and the logistics or the port centers. But I do think that we do need to realize that there are some challenges. There are geopolitical issues. There are existential challenges to us, be it another pandemic. But there's also another key element that is also a big threat, and that is us ourselves as an industry. If we do not fix up and we do not ensure that we actually can operate effectively and efficiently as an industry, we ourselves are putting our future threat at risk. We need to find the solution ourselves. It's all good and well that we looked at COVID and that we looked at the issues in Ukraine. These are issues that are highlighting the challenges, but there's a third element, and that's actually upon ourselves to actually fix and actually look at some of these problems. However, over and above some of the issues that have been highlighted, why there's still a support for global trade, I would like to just mention three others that I think that are really important. The one is intellectual property ownership. Now, we know that this has been an issue in the past and is probably a root cause for some of these global disturbances and disruptions that we have at national levels. However, industries, companies are getting better at protecting their own IP. And if they can get better at protecting their own intellectual property, they're going to have better ability to actually control that whatever that intellectual property it is. If it's a new form of plastic or if it's a new fuel or whatever, they're going to get better at being able to control that, and that is going to create the demand in itself. That demand will still mean that we still need global supply chains. So it might be a little bit different than in the past, but intellectual property and protection of intellectual property will mean that we're still going to need supply chains in the future. The next one is speed of innovation. With a lot of information, a lot of data, a lot of sharing out there, the speed of innovation is absolutely amazing. And it's a little bit about the same story, that those that can actually have that speed to innovate quicker will need to be able to have access to markets to be able to distribute. They're going to have to have supply chains that actually can push their products through. But they're going to be the first. So any user of that is going to want to have access to that particular technology. They're going to then have to use supply chains to get access to that technology. And quite interestingly, we actually see that. I mean, there's a big in focus idea that China are now building their own airliner, their own aircraft, right? The comic C919. And yes, they are. But most of the components in order to make that thing fly come from elsewhere. So yes, they're building it, they're assembling it, and some of the key elements they're building in China itself, but that componentry is actually coming from elsewhere. And that's really because of that speed of innovation, right? Lighter materials, carbons, etc., right? And the other also goes true for the other way around, right? In the battery industry, China has the lead in terms of the speed of innovation. And so that's also going to support this idea that we're going to need supply chains in the future. And then, of course, the speed of tech development, right? Not only, and here, it's not the same as innovation per se. The speed of the tech development, a lot of this technology is actually expensive. And you actually have a capital investment that you actually have to recover in terms of the money that you're putting into that thing. I mean, to build a battery plant is not cheap, right? So your amortization period for those particular assets is probably 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, right? So those batteries, like it or not, batteries are going to be around for another 10, 15, 20 years. The hydrogen cell car and other technologies may well come, but you're still going to have that battery technology. And you're going to have supply chains to actually get that distribution moving and keep it going. However, with all of this, I think as an industry, we found that we have a problem. And the problem really and I'll go back to this other issue, that is something within our control. And the problem as an industry is that we have that the intermediaries have actually commoditized the container, specifically the container trade, to the nth degree. They've commoditized it to such an extent that there is no more redundancy left in the system. And we actually saw that when we had these existential problems, right? There was COVID and there was Ukraine. What did we see? The freight rates absolutely went through the roof. Why? Because it was simple supply and demand. The intermediaries in our industry actually pushed and commoditized the product to such an extent that when the push came, there was no redundancy left and everything went through the roof. And I think that's something that is a big driver for us to say, okay, you know what, we need to look at both the resilience and the redundancy in the market. And that maybe takes us to this. These are the two drivers of why we're going to see an integration in the supply chain business. The first is this resilience. Resilience means agile. It means being able to be responsive quicker. It means having increased adaptability. Not one of those things was possible through this crisis period. Not one of them. All the intermediaries, all the freight forwarders that you pay to get your box from A to B couldn't do it. They couldn't offer you the resilience that they promised. However, as much as, and I mean, actually, if you look at it, if you actually look at what it was, and if you take it that, and the number I use here is probably a hypothetical, but we'll use it as a surrogate number. This was the margins that was made by some of the global freight forwarding companies that are published in their annual financial statements. The margin that they made pre-crisis from 2016 to 2019 was 5.9%. And in essence, conceptually, that's what a freight forwarder should offer you, because it was a service to be able to get your goods from A to B at the best price. They also promised you the best service, that they'll be able to get your box from A to B. And that's what it was costing you. That resilience, that's what they're promising you, right? That resilience was actually costing 5.9% in the period of 2016 to 2019. The same number in 2020 to 2022 went up to 9.8%. And we know what happened with all the delays and etc., right? So not only did they give you a poorer service, the end user, the customer at the end of the day, the cargo owner, not only did they give a poorer service, but the cost to the end user also went up almost double. Went up to 9.8%. So interestingly, in the old days, there was an absolute role for the intermediaries, the freight forwarders, because it was a complex industry. It was a real complex industry, and nobody really knew their way around. And the intermediary would say, okay, I know my way around. I can do this. I know documents you need to do. I know where to get prices, etc., etc. And it was a good service, right? But they actually took it to the extreme, and there was no resilience left in the industry. However, there also was no redundancy left, because redundancy is basically, by definition, the security, reduced downtime, minimized disruption. There was no redundancy left in the market either. That's really because there was no capacity. The asset owners had been completely commoditized. There was no capacity left in the market. So if you really look at it, resilience on the one side is talking about this ability to be agile, get an alternative, right? That's the service side of it. And the redundancy side is really the asset owner side. There was no redundancy left either. All the terminals were full. Storage rates went through the roof. There was no capacity in the vessels afloat, right? So there were those two issues that were a massive problem. So part of the solution is that the ports and terminals, and that's really what we're here today, is right. This is the Terminal Operators Conference of Europe, right? The ports and terminals are key and central in this whole flow. They're going to be a central part in what's going to play out and how it's going to evolve into the future. Because that is infrastructure. That is a physical location, that is a space, a spot where all those cargoes flow across. So whichever way it's going to play out in the future is going to be a central part of the solution point. The trick is going to be how do we bring that additional service? How do we bring the resilience and the agility to that particular equation? So this is how we see the traditional model. A traditional model. You would have asset owner, you would have intermediary, and you'd have cargo owner. The future will evolve to a point where you have an integrated logistics provider who is going to be offering services to the cargo owner. This is not a secret. This is already underway. We know some of the big shipping lines are way ahead, and we know that the terminal operators are also moving into the space in a hurry. So this is really how we see it moving forward. What will be important, though, is that whoever has access over what we call the choke points in the supply chain, those are going to be the asset, the infrastructure choke points. That's where the real difference is going to be. Because if you can provide a redundancy over those choke points to the end customer, that's the value proposition that you're going to bring. That's the differentiation that you're going to be able to bring. It's not going to be able to be, can you price or can you procure freight rates at the lowest rate? No. It's can you secure and ensure that you can actually move those boxes around for the customer by having control over those choke points. But it's not exclusively that. You also need to be able to offer the customer choice. So you need to go into and move into that service area. You need to be able to create the capabilities and the capacities to be able to offer alternative rates, alternative routings, alternative ways of moving the cargo around. Now, this is the business intelligence theater, so I think it would be remiss of me not to talk a little bit about data and the digital race. Now, this is not the panacea, and it's not the silver bullet that we all expected to be 5-10 years ago. Blockchain and digital platforms have not solved all of the problems. And actually, they couldn't. They can play a real active role in developing transparency and actually moving us in that direction. They can make certain processes more efficient. But the problem is that the blockchain and those digital platforms don't own assets. There are some other issues around it. Things like data sharing concerns, lack of standardization and definitions of data. And my favorite is that we've never been able to come to terms with the price of data. Data is not free. We all seem to think we should just be able to give it away, but it's not free. And then, of course, the other topic that I mentioned earlier is the amortization of the actual assets itself. If you invest in assets, you need to have a fair period to actually be able to return on it. So how is DP World positioning ourselves for this? We do have a large asset presence. We believe that we are going to be moving in as a supply chain solution architect. And that's really what it means. I think this is a relationship that you have to build up with the customer, that you actually sit down with them, and you can actually become a solutions architect to their supply chains. It also means, or doesn't mean, that you only exclusively offer your own asset products, but you use your own assets to be able to ensure that you can give them the redundancy they need, and then you provide a service to other players in the industry, because the industry alone, just in Northwest Europe, the logistics industry is $3 trillion. There is no ways that any single player can actually dominate that market. As big as Kuehne+Nagel, as big as DSV, as big as Maersk, as big as DP World think we are, none of us can dominate that. But if we can actually offer a service to specific customers where we can control those choke points or key asset points along the chain, and we can supplement that with a solutions architect type processes, then you're going to be able to have true integration, and you're going to be able to solve the problems of both resilience and redundancy. So maybe just before closing off and referring back to the digital idea, actually before I get there, there is one caveat before I get there, and that is that the business model has not yet been perfected. There isn't a perfect business model yet, but it definitely is something that's coming. And it's definitely something that is moving, and I think you're all going to be part of it, because the ports and terminals is a key central point in this whole flow. Every single piece of cargo that moves has to and will move across the port. So you guys are going to be part of this process. I think what is interesting is how you're actually going to build these relationships with the other players in the industry. Because this integration model is going to come, and it is going to come. Why? Because the customer demands both resilience and redundancy. But maybe not just to leave poor old digital out there completely. What I did is I asked the same question of everybody's favorite friend today, GTP Chat and OpenAI. And I asked it for what it thought would be the resolution to our problems. And then the comment that came back was, by leveraging resilience to adapt and recover and incorporating redundancy for critical components or processes, organizations can enhance overall ability to withstand and manage disruptions effectively. So the business model is coming, and is even supported by GTP Chat OpenAI. Thank you very much for your time.